Thank you for taking the time to learn more about the Church's teaching on immigration and the U.S. Bishop's position on immigration reform. I want to say from the start that this is not a partisan effort attempting to support one political party or just one political solution to a problem which all Americans agree ought to be addressed. This video is simply meant to provide the Church's teaching in order to give a context to the U.S. Bishop's specific requests surrounding immigration reform. If you have questions about this video, feel free to contact me, Omar Gutierrez, Manager of the Office of Missions and Justice for the Archdiocese of Omaha. The website for the Archdiocese is www.archomaha.org. One of the things one may hear in this debate is the claim that the bishops need to stay out of politics. While it is true that as a 501c3 nonprofit, the Catholic Church and so her bishops are not allowed to comment publicly on individual candidates or on political parties, it is also true that the Church can and may speak openly about public policy and specific legislation. According to the IRS, nonprofit organizations like the Church may make these comments openly and freely without violating their nonprofit status, so long as this work does not make up a majority of the overall activity of the organization. It should be noted that commentary on public policy and on legislation often places the Church in a situation of seeming to support one party or candidate over another. While the Church does need to be careful about the perception of being partisan, it would be actual partisanship if the Church refused to speak the truth of the gospel for fear that it might harm one particular political party. Furthermore, the Church is involved as she is because she is made up of the people of God, who live and work in societies governed by laws. The tradition has always been that the Christian participate in society in order to help bring about the common good, a good which is made up of laws and customs determined in large part by the laity. According to the Church's teaching, Christians have a moral obligation to work towards justice and mercy. Knowing what these look like in today's world requires the wisdom and experience of the Church, which is an expert in humanity. The Church then helps to guide the laity in the formation of conscience as we attempt to bring about the common good in light of our faith. Finally, the American founders foresaw a people ruled by the Constitution and the branches of government, but formed, ultimately, by religions. The founders understood that for our representative democracy to work, a virtuous people would be necessary. As John Adams, our second president, said, "We have a constitution built for a religious people." Our faith, therefore, ought to be part of our approach to public policy, and the bishops are a gift to us from Jesus in order to help us understand how our faith intersects with the public square. Another question often heard in this debate is that this matter of immigration is a matter of prudence, and so the bishops should stick to doctrines and principles, but leave the prudential matters to the laity. This is an important point, easily misunderstood. It is true that there is a distinction between matters of doctrinal principle and prudential considerations. All Catholics should agree on the principles, which can be found in Catholic social teaching, and in documents like the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. However, applying those principles to concrete situations or public policy can make things more complicated. The bishops are, after all, not experts in economics and theology and social science and international diplomacy. Furthermore, the experts which the bishops employ to help guide and inform their positions on public policy are not necessarily immune from error or partisanship or simple innocent prejudice. Let us look at an example. The Church teaches in several papal encyclicals, in the Catechism, and in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church that laborers have a right to a just wage. That right to a just wage is the principle. But how society and the state and the private sector help to secure that right is a different question altogether. Should it be through a minimum wage, or through wage supplements, or through a tax credit? Even then, ought the minimum wage suggested be federal or at the state level, in order to pay respect to the principle of subsidiarity? Should wage supplements be offered to individuals or rather to households? Should the tax credit be at this level or another? These are all prudential questions, the answers to which involve a level of expertise that points us toward the virtue of prudence. Good Catholics could argue over the prudence of this or that public policy answer to the question of a just wage. The specific position in favor of a wage supplement and against a minimum wage hike would not necessarily make one a bad Catholic, but we should all be in agreement that a just wage is a fundamental right. While that is all true, there are situations in which the prudential choice is so clear that it is not a matter of debate. As an example, abortion, as the U.S. bishops have argued, is an intrinsic evil. Some have said that this is a matter of prudence as to whether or not abortion ought to be illegal. The truth is, however, that so long as abortion is legal, our entire legal system, according to the U.S. bishops, is, quote, fundamentally flawed, unquote. We cannot achieve social justice, and so the common good, so long as our government states that it is okay to kill the unborn child. The only logical position with regard to abortion is to make it illegal. How we do so as a nation is a matter of prudential debate, over which Catholics can argue. But that it should be illegal ought not be something we disagree on. The question before us, then, is whether immigration reform is such a clear-cut question. Is it a matter of prudence, so that we can ignore doing anything at all this time? Or are there necessary goals which must be pursued, and means to those goals of which good Catholics can argue? So let us now ask, what are the principles that we can apply given the current situation in the United States? The main principle we will cover is the principle of solidarity, which states that we have a moral obligation to care for our neighbor. As a teaching, this is perhaps best demonstrated in the Scriptures in 3 separate accounts. The first is the story of the Good Samaritan. In St. Luke's Gospel, a lawyer asks Jesus, "Who is our neighbor?" We are familiar with the story, so I will not retell it. However, let us look at 2 aspects. First, the 2 men who passed by the man left for dead, the priest and the Levite, passed by him not because they did not see the man. Scripture scholars suggest that because the man looked dead, the 2 passed by him because to touch a dead body would have rendered them ritually unclean. They would have not been able to offer sacrifices in the temple. In essence, the 2 men who passed by calculated that the law prohibited them from helping this man in need. Jesus' story, then, at least tells us that people are more important than man-made laws, such as the Levitical laws were. Secondly, when the lawyer is asked which of the 3 proved to be a neighbor, the lawyer, not even able to bring himself to say the name Samaritan, simply said, "the one who showed mercy." The second lesson is that mercy is the mark of the follower of Christ, and of the one who can enjoy eternal life. The next example from Scripture is the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Again, we are familiar with the story. Lazarus suffers at the gates of the rich man's house, while the latter feasts with friends. They both die, and Lazarus enjoys life at the bosom of Abraham, while the rich man languishes in Hades, or hell. Again, there are 2 observations here. First, we know nothing about the rich man apart from what Jesus tells us. For all we know, this rich man could have been a good father, a fine husband, a pillar of the community. He could have been a very nice guy, except that he passed by Lazarus every day and ignored the suffering of this poor man. For that, we are told by Jesus, he suffers in hell. The second point is that therefore the teaching from Jesus himself is that failing to help our neighbor who is suffering and whose life is in danger from poverty can have eternal consequences for our soul. This is, of course, the lesson of the third and final example from sacred Scripture. In St. Matthew's Gospel, we find Jesus telling the disciples what the last judgment will be like. He explains that when we feed the hungry and clothe the naked and give drink to the thirsty, we do it to him. Our end will be adjudicated not according to how much we know about the faith, but whether or not we live in solidarity with those who suffer around us. Pope St. John Paul II referred to solidarity as something more than just a vague feeling of sorrow. He said in his 1987 document on social concerns that solidarity is an intentional choice for the good of others, a choice motivated by the realization that, quote, we are all really responsible for all, unquote. So that is the driving principle of Catholic social teaching here with regard to immigration. It may not be the only principle, but it is the most relevant to the Church's position on immigration and immigration reform. Let us move then from responsibilities, the responsibility to care for our neighbor, to rights, and let us start with the fundamental right to life. Again, it was Pope St. John Paul II who wrote, in his 1993 document on the laity, that while we can talk about a right to a just wage, and education, and a right to family, and a right to work, all these rights are, quote, false and illusory, unquote, if the right to life is not defended to the maximum. This is another reason why the Church holds the right to life, and so the connected issue of abortion, in such high regard. But the flip side of the Holy Father's point is that these other rights he mentioned, the right to work, the family, to education, they are all connected to the right to life. Let us see how. If we understand that the right to life is the basis of our rights, then access to those things that support life, such as food and water for starters, must also be something of a right. We understand, for instance, that it would be a farce if the government were to come to someone and say that they have a right to life, but no right to food and water. We realize that this situation makes no sense because without food and water, we have no life. These things are so essential to life that to claim we do not have a right to access them would be to undo any real right to life. So, for my right to life to mean anything, I must have a right to access food and water. The next question we must ask ourselves is, how do we access food and water? Well, since it doesn't just appear, we have to dig for it, hunt for it, gather it, grow it, etc. In other words, we have to labor for it. The right to work or labor is an extension of what we believe about the right to life. Without the right to labor, I cannot access food and water. And if I cannot do that, then I have no real right to life. Now, as we think about this further, we come to realize that labor is only part of the equation. I need to make sure, for instance, that when I plant a seed today, the land in which I planted it is still mine a month from now. For this reason, the Church speaks of the right to private property. We have a right to private property because we have a right, through labor, to secure food and water, because we have a right to life. In fact, Pope Leo XIII, who is the father of modern Catholic social teaching, makes this point in his document Rerum Novarum. Going forward still, we can see that if I cannot gather or hunt or grow my own food, I can trade my labor for food and water, or for money with which I can buy food and water. But in order for this to work, I have to be able to exchange enough of my labor for enough food and water for me to live. This is why the Church talks about a just wage. A just wage is one which allows me, let's just say at the very minimum, to access enough food and water so that I can live. Now, as we start getting further away from the right to life, things do start to become more complicated. A just wage, for instance, must be negotiated with the resources of a business. Even Pope Pius XI will write that it makes no sense for a laborer to demand a wage so high that it destroys the business. Nevertheless, a just wage is a right, because we have a right to food and water, because we have a right to life. Now we come to the right to migrate, or the right to immigration. If I cannot find enough labor or enough food and water where I am right now, it is not as though my right to life is now forfeit. I have a right to try to go find that labor and that food and water elsewhere. Again, like a just wage, this is a complicated issue because it involves the rights of others. But the process of balancing out the right to migrate with the rights of others is part of what societies have to figure out in the context of our responsibilities to care for our neighbor. Rights never exist by themselves. They always exist with a corresponding responsibility. We should also mention, of course, the right to family. Family is the fundamental cell of society. Families do not exist for societies, but rather societies for families. Families provide the context of life. As social beings, we cannot reach our potential without them. We would not and could not exist without them. The Church therefore has taught very clearly that the family is more important than society, and so the rights to one's own family is sacrosanct. I hope it is clear by now that though there are complicated issues, these rights of which I speak are all at least connected to the right to life, our fundamental right, about which, again, Pope St. John Paul II says that if we did not have it, all our other rights would be false and illusory. But what about a right to secure a border? The Catechism, in the section on the right to immigration, does speak about the right of a nation to secure their border. In the Catechism, section 2241, paragraph 2, we read, "Political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions, especially with regard to the immigrants' duties toward their country of adoption." So, yes, nations have the right to secure borders because of their responsibility for the common good. In this case, the common good involves at least, but is not limited to, security. We know, for instance, that there are people who want to come into our nation in order to kill us, to kill innocents, to end the lives of entire families. This makes this a matter of the right to life as well. The state must also consider economics. Can our infrastructure carry many more people? Are there enough jobs for an influx of people? What will the influx of laborers do to the labor market and the wages of those already here? And we can also consider the rule of law. A just law is just only if I am reasonably aware that it applies to me. Borders help us to know and understand when and where a law applies, and gives me the freedom to live by that law. So now that we have looked at responsibilities and rights, what does all of this mean for immigration? We must first ask some prudential questions because, as was said before, once the principles are determined, applying them becomes a matter of prudence. One argument against immigration reform and the U.S. bishop's position is that those who come here illegally are breaking the law and so are behaving immorally. If they are immoral, why are the bishops defending their behavior? To address that reasonable question, we must first ask, is every illegal act immoral? The answer of the Church, and of human reason throughout the ages, is that no, not every illegal act is immoral. The classic example is the one from history. I am in Nazi Germany and I hide a Jew. Am I being immoral? We would all agree that no, even though I am breaking the law, I am not being immoral. But the astute listener will respond that the anti-Semitic laws of Germany were unjust laws to begin with. The Church has always taught that unjust laws are no laws at all, and so we are not bound to follow them. But since a secure border is a matter of the common good, and so a just law, what does the Church say about that? Is it not immoral to break that law? The Church, and again reason, answer that there are at least two types of laws. The first type is connected to the very nature of the human person. We can call these natural laws. That is, they are the kind of laws which touch on the very dignity of the human person. For instance, we say that when someone lies under oath while someone's life and property is on the line, we can jail that person. The perjury laws speak to the very nature of a person's dignity, the dignity of life and the dignity in their private property. Or let's take murder as well. If murder is outlawed, but the penalty for first-degree murder is only a month, we recognize that the law fails to reflect the natural law. This is because, by providing such a light sentence, it communicates to society that we do not consider life to be very important. Again, this is why the fact that abortion is legal in the United States is such an affront to justice. So long as it is legal, we are saying to ourselves and to the rest of the world that we do not consider human dignity to be very important. So the first type of law is a law that is connected to the very dignity of the human person. But the second type of law is one which is not connected. We can call these positive laws, in the sense that we assert them, make them up, or we posit them. An example of this kind of law would be the speed limit. If the speed limit were to change from 35 to 40 or 37, or if we were to switch from miles per hour to kilometers per hour, our understanding of human dignity would not change. Certainly, some very bright people came up with these numbers for a reason. They are not entirely arbitrary. However, if we change them, we do not call into question the fundamental dignity of the human person. Furthermore, if I were to break this law, I would not be violating the natural law or even necessarily be immoral. If I am speeding, do I have to confess that? Well, it depends on how fast I am going, but no one believes that one need confess going over 4 miles over the speed limit. If I am speeding in order to get my wife to the hospital because she is in labor, the police officer who pulls me over would probably understand, and then speed with me, with his sirens on. But if I am speeding to get the new iPhone, well then that is a problem, and it is probably immoral, because I'm endangering others in order to acquire a thing. The point is that while these positive laws exist for a reason, I might bend these laws, or even break these laws, if life, like the life of my wife or unborn child, were on the line. Likewise, the border laws are not natural laws, but rather positive laws. If we change the border with Canada from the 49th parallel to the 52nd, what we believe about the nature of human dignity would not change. Our moral universe would not crumble. Border laws are not arbitrary. There are reasons for them, as explained before, but when life is on the line, these laws can be bent or even broken without incurring the accusation of immorality. Our own laws in the United States recognize this when people who are legitimate refugees come to the country illegally. So no, not every illegal act is immoral. Our second prudential question is, are all rights absolute? Again, the Church's teaching and human reason say no. No right is absolute, not even the right to life. If someone is coming at my child with an axe, and I cannot stop that person by any other means but by deadly force, I am allowed and obliged to stop that person from murdering an innocent child. The right to life of the attacker is forfeited because of their clearly stated intention to kill an innocent. So if the right to life is not absolute, then certainly the right to secure a border, or the right to private property, is no absolute right either. With positive laws, the circumstances are important. This leads to the third important prudential question. How do we balance justice when two groups or persons experience opposing rights? This is an important question in our representative democracy. What happens when my right claim comes up against your right claim? The Church begins to approach this matter by asking which of the rights in question is the more fundamental. To make this clear, let us take the example given to us by Victor Hugo in his novel Les Miserables. Jean Valjean steals bread from a baker in order to feed a little girl. He has then violated the private property rights of the baker in order to attend to the right to life of the little girl. Now, as in all of moral theology, one must look at the circumstances. We need to be sure that the little girl had no recourse. We ought to ask whether there were other alternatives Jean Valjean could have pursued. We need to be sure that what he's stealing does not jeopardize the life of the baker and his family. But presuming all of that works out just right, we can say that Jean Valjean did nothing morally wrong. Remember that the right to private property exists only because we have a right to life. The more fundamental right in this case is the right to life. As was said, the Church begins to approach this matter by asking which of the rights in question is the more fundamental. And remember that the right to private property exists only because we have a right to life. The more fundamental right in this case, then, is the right to life. And remember that we all have a responsibility to care for our neighbor. That baker has a moral responsibility to care for others, including this little girl. Again, things change if the baker now is in danger of losing his business and so his livelihood. But since that was not the case, we can say that Jean Valjean did nothing immoral. He saved a life. Now with these prudential questions addressed and our principles laid out, let us finally turn to what the Catechism says about immigration. We shall look at these two paragraphs in section 2241 carefully. First, the more prosperous nations are obliged. Notice that it does not say encouraged or invited to, but rather obliged. We were talking then of a moral obligation attached to prosperous nations. Next, to the extent that they are able. This is a very important clause, but it is one which I will have to bracket for the moment. I will return to it at the end. The more prosperous nations are obliged to welcome the foreigner. At this point, many people ask whether or not the Church expects the United States to accept everyone in the world. If we take on everyone who wants to come here, then everyone would come, and we would be overwhelmed. But read how the Church qualifies the foreigner. To welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. So it is not just any and every foreigner, but rather those foreigners who cannot find security or livelihood in their home nation. Why would this be the case? Well, because they have a right to life, and everyone has the responsibility to care for their neighbor, as Jesus said. If someone is in danger for their life because of political or religious persecution, or because, as is the case in Honduras, for instance, the drug cartels are threatening their lives unless they pay a protection tax, then the prosperous nation is obliged to welcome them. If someone cannot find enough work or food and water where they live, so that they and their families are in danger of starvation, then again this obligation kicks in. The Catechism goes on. Public authorities should see to it that the natural right is respected, that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. So not only are nations obliged to welcome those in danger for their lives, but they are required to protect them. Political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions, especially with regard to the immigrants' duties toward their country of adoption. We saw this sentence before, but all it is saying is the state has a right to make the right to immigrate subject to laws. If someone is in danger for their life in El Salvador, for instance, and wants to come here, we are allowed to ask them about their personal background and to attend to other legal issues. If in that process we discover that they pose a threat to the common good of the people of the United States, then the state has the right to refuse that person, and so refuse their right to immigrate, because no right is absolute. Immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them, to obey its laws, and to assist in carrying civic burdens. It is good to know that immigrants have obligations too. They have to respect the host country and its laws. Now some at this point will say that since those here illegally have broken the law, this means that our obligation to them is null and void. But that is not how this works. I do not have time in this video to go over the legal questions, but know that for many of those who have a legitimate claim to come here because their life is in danger, there is no way to come here legally. It is at this point that we should move to what the U.S. bishops are asking. First, they ask for earned legalization with the path to citizenship. Why earned legalization? Well, because those here illegally did in fact break the law. Coming here illegally is a misdemeanor. The bishops are open to having those here illegally pay a fine and pay back taxes in order to make amends for their crime. This is why, by definition, this cannot be called amnesty. Why a path to citizenship? Well, first, let's be clear that the bishops are only asking for a path. What that path looks like is something good Catholics can argue about. It could be a 3-year path, it could be a 20-year path, but there should be some path. The Senate bill which passed some time ago would have made citizenship possible only after a 13-year process, at the very least, which is to say that the soonest someone here illegally could have possibly voted would have been 13 years after the passage of the bill. In that time, they would have had to have been constantly employed. They could not have committed any felonies, or more than a certain number of misdemeanors. As Americans, we may make the path hard, but we ought to have a path. Because after someone has been here for so many years, raised a family, contributed to their community, they deserve to be able to begin to voice their opinion about the course of this nation's laws. And a path helps them fulfill what the Catechism tells us, which is their obligation to assist in carrying civic burdens. Second, the bishops ask for a reform of the visa system, which has not been updated since the 1986 immigration reform. At that time, the number of low-skilled worker visas was lowered significantly. Temporary worker visas for seasonal work is very low as well. Yet we know that U.S. businesses hire these workers. The demand and the supply are both there. The visa laws should reflect that reality so that laborers and businesses can both function on the right side of the law. Third, that the reform of immigration laws better reflect the priority of the family. Currently, the wait for bringing family into the United States, depending on the country and on the relation, can take over 10 years. Let us give preference to families, because they are the fundamental cell of society. What's more, if we are to focus on those immigrants whose lives are in danger through the lack of security or lack of opportunity, then it only makes sense to allow them to bring their whole family here in order to protect them from the life-threatening violence and poverty back home. Fourth, that we reform due process. In the 1996 immigration reform, when someone here illegally was arrested, they would be put in jail with no opportunity for bail while the deportation process went along. At a great cost to the taxpayer, individuals whose only crime was a misdemeanor crossing are treated as though they are murderers. So if the individual is not a risk to the community and is not a flight risk, then allow them to post bail and be with their families while they await the judgment of the immigration court. Also, the penalty for coming here illegally was set at a 10-year exile. The choice, then, for many of those here legally and with family is very stark. Face 10 years away from one's family, or consider coming back illegally. It is no wonder, then, why so many break the law again. Let us reform those laws. Fifth, what can we do as a nation to address the root causes of those who come here? Can we invest in the markets of those nations in order to encourage economic growth, and so more jobs, so that they need not come here? Can we do more or something different about the drug culture of the United States, which feeds the cartels, which terrorize the people of Central America? Sixth, and finally, let us enforce our laws. One of the problems of illegal immigration is that our nation has not enforced our laws for some time now. We do not have a secure border. So let us secure our border, because that's part of what reform means too. Also, let us do a better job of tracking those who violate the conditions of their lawful visas. Depending on the year, somewhere between 45% to 55% of illegal immigration happens through those who overstay their visas. Those who come here on student and other visas tend to be from better financial backgrounds than those who cross the border. Prosperous nations are not obliged to welcome them, so let us enforce our laws better. Again, good Catholics can argue about some of these details, but it should be clear that the bishops are not asking for anything radical, but just that some reform take place. Now, let me return to that clause to the extent that they are able. Many will say that while all of this sounds good, the U.S. economy simply cannot bring on many more poor people, that our economy is such that we are already strained. it is true that our economy is strained. The stagnation in wages for lower and middle-class laborers and the ever-increasing debt that mounts and which will be foisted on later generations is an immoral situation. Certainly, as a nation, we ought to address these concerns through reforms of our economic system and of our social service system. However, we must be careful about what we consider is necessary, or what we mean by able. With no intention to chastise anyone, I should point out that despite the lackluster economy over the last 6 years, in 2013, Americans spent $55.7 billion on pets. Not livestock, but pets. We spent $96 billion on beer in the same year. We spent over $20 billion on video games, $1.4 billion on over-the-counter teeth whiteners, $2.3 billion on tattoos. 6% of American households own a second home they're not renting out. Now, many of these things are good things, of course. Again, this is not meant to chastise anyone. But these figures are a reminder that our nation is prosperous beyond any other in the history of mankind. We can still afford, despite the poor economy, all these things. So it is important to remind ourselves that sometimes what we think we're not able to do is perfectly possible with the aid of God, who cares so dearly for those who suffer. I would encourage everyone to pray deeply about what they are able to do for the sake of their neighbor. Thank you. And again, if you have questions about this video, feel free to contact me, Omar Gutierrez, from the Archdiocese, www.archomaha.org.